You know, America isn't driven by ideologies the way that Italy or Germany were. But America is driven by profit very often. And it's quite extraordinary. When the Berlin Wall fell, the third of the US economy that is defense manufacturing was facing a declining market share because we lost our global enemy. And what do you have to do if you're losing a global enemy and you're the defense industry? Make a new enemy, exactly. They were looking at a real economic catastrophe unless they could hype a new enemy, enter the global war on terror. And what happened was that these weapons manufacturers who used to make Cold War weapons shifted their manufacturing to what's called the security industrial complex technologies, surveillance and security. And they have lobbyists, and their lobbyists work closely with Homeland Security. And it's this, again, multi-billion-dollar industry. And so the best way to make sure that you're going to have continued profits is not just to hype a relatively minor enemy, serious but minor, the way that England and Spain sees the terror threat as serious but not a global war, right? Gordon Brown has said it's a crime, not a cause. It's not a global war. The way you make sure to generate profit is to be sure that the enemy you create is us, that we are the enemy in need of surveillance. So why is this so personal for me? For about a year and a half, every time I got on a plane, are you guys okay? Yeah. No, I always ask this at this point in the talk because, it's a lot. But I do admire Americans because they're like, we can handle it. No, seriously. I sometimes feel overwhelmed by this stuff. I often do. Well, for a year and a half, every time I got on a plane, I would get a quadruple S, high-risk security threat symbol on my boarding pass. Now, I'm a short Jewish girl from New York. And in what way do I fit a global terrorist profile? The short Jewish girls with their credit cards rampaging through the globe, the big threat. But I was always taken aside and given extra searching, and I kept asking, why are you doing this? Why? Finally, a nice young woman from the TSA said, you're on the list. And I'm like, the list? I'm on the list? And her supervisor sort of hustled her away. And I did some research, I reported it out, and I was in very good company. Richard Murphy, the nation's foremost constitutional scholar, who had just given a speech, he's a Princeton scholar, critical of Bush's assault on the Constitution, was on the list. Two nice little old ladies from San Francisco who run an anti-war newsletter called War Times are on the list. I just heard that one of the leaders of Code Pink, the anti-war group, was turned back from Canada. She was not allowed to cross the border, which is a classic fascist tactic of closing borders to critics and dissidents. She's on the list. Two staffers at the ACLU are on the list. One of the leaders of Greenpeace is on the list. I get these emails I can't bear to open. A decorated war hero started crying when I spoke to him 2 days ago when I was in Denver because he'd flown all these combat missions. He was so brave, but he broke down when he was describing how not only is he on the list for having criticized the administration, his family's on the list. His 15-year-old child is on the list. So this is very bad because, if you follow the Washington Post, you see that the level of surveillance that is now directed at us is at such a high level that when you get on a plane, they know what you're reading, who you're sitting next to, where you're going when you get off the plane, and what the phone number is of the person you're going to visit. It's gotten to the point where before I got into the line for security at LaGuardia, I realized I was carrying a copy of Tara McKelvey's book Monstering, which is about CIA interrogations, and some of it is classified information, as all good reporting is based on classified information. And I threw it away, a $30 hardcover. I put it in the garbage because, I was too scared to go through security with it. So it's very, very bad when there's a security apparatus aimed at ordinary citizens because you start by getting on the no-fly list or the watch list, but there are lists, and this is a classic fascist thing to do. They did it in Italy, they did it in Germany. You get on the list, and pretty soon welfare benefits, job opportunities close down if you're on the list. and other unpleasant things happened. When I got to Vermont, where I was copy editing this book, I had my computer inside my suitcase, and I got to my hotel room and I unzipped my suitcase, and on top of my computer was a letter from Homeland Security in my suitcase. So it's not good. So I'm going to just zip through some of the other steps. The fifth thing you do in closing down an open society is arbitrarily detain and release citizens. You infiltrate citizens' groups. The ACLU has many lawsuits against the infiltration of ordinary groups here in Seattle. I'm sure anti-war groups, environmental groups, total non-terrorist groups are, if it's typical of the rest of the country, being infiltrated by police or intelligence agents who dress like you or me. In fact, they're probably possibly here tonight. And no, seriously, hello. Yes, right? And you infiltrate citizens' groups, and that's an important piece in breaking down democracy, because then citizens don't have the trust level of working effectively together. You target key individuals. I mean, there's some amazing examples of this, and again, I keep getting emails every day. Everyone from the JAG military lawyers, these patriotic lawyers, probably most of them Republicans, who were told to sell out their clients, the detainees, and refused to because they're lawyers. They're not allowed to do that. It would violate their oath. And their careers were derailed. To Bill Maher, who said one thing and pressure was put on CBS, was it CBS, on his parent company to fire him. To Dan Rather, who just brought a $70 million lawsuit against Viacom for being ousted because of White House pressure. This is, again, a Goebbels tactic that you target key individuals, people in the press, academics, people in the media, performers, so, you know, the Dixie Chicks, so that people see that you crash and burn or there are repercussions if you stand up. You restrict the press is the next step, and the classic example of this is, remember the Swift banking story when the New York Times under executive editor Bill Keller reported this classified program that the White House was following banking, financial records. So there was this drumbeat from the White House, treason, 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 right? They should be prosecuted under the Espionage Act. And Melanie Morgan actually called for a prosecution for treason, and one of the consequences of a conviction for treason is execution. And she's like, whatever, that's fine. So this was really scary to me because I was reading, you know, in a strong democracy, that's just hype, that's just language. It's just like, oh, God, they're at it again, you know, the right wing. But in a weakening democracy, it starts to get not so funny. And really not funny when you're reading Stalin, and you find out that in 1937, Nikolai Bukharin, who actually was the publisher of Izvestia, which was the equivalent of the New York Times for Russia at that time, was charged with treason and actually executed in the Third Moscow Show trial. And this espionage, what happens in a closing society is there starts to be a drumbeat of words like terrorist, enemy of the people, sabotage, espionage, treason. And the definition of terrorist or traitor or spy starts to expand and expand, entangling more and more people, more and more criminalization of speech. So, for instance, the blueprint is so predictive. Because of what I know about the blueprint, I could tell when a law was passed last fall expanding the definition of terrorist to include animal rights activists. I knew that within about 6 months, people who looked like the boy or girl next door would be called terrorists and prosecuted, and that's exactly what happened by about March, about 6 months later. By the same token, you know, we were talking about the blurring of the line and how predictive it is. You know from history that the first people to be tried under the Military Commissions Act are likely to be white and English-speaking. And in fact, David Hicks, a white English-speaking prisoner, was among the first to be tried by the military commissions. It's so predictive that the tasering of this kid happened right, you know, like according to the clock. So, you know, there's this drumbeat, espionage, you know, there was this drumbeat to charge people who released or revealed classified information with the 1917 Espionage Act. This sounds sensible. We're at war. You don't want spies. But the history of the